I was sitting at our dining table, leaning back against the chair, lazily dragging my fork across the plate. Joshua, sitting opposite me, collected, focused, was thoughtfully chewing his steak. There was a fleeting shadow in his eyes, something I couldn't quite decipher. We had just discussed our weekend plans. I had suggested a picnic by the lake, but he preferred cleaning out the garage. Typical Joshua. "Are you happy, Maddie?" His voice shattered the silence like breaking glass. I froze. Could he sense it? Or was it just a random thought spoken at the wrong moment? Trying to mask the turmoil inside, I took a sip of wine. "Why do you ask?" My voice sounded calm, though doubts were swirling furiously in my head. "Just curious," he shrugged. "You've seemed thoughtful a lot lately. I feel like I'm missing something." Missing something? Oh, he had no idea how much he was missing. Like how I often stared at my reflection in the mirror, wondering if I had become invisible in my own home. Or how it seemed that our conversations had boiled down to shopping lists and discussions about chores. "Everything's fine," I finally said, aware that such a short statement couldn't bear the weight of the truth. Joshua nodded and went back to his meal, as if my answer had satisfied him, yet there was something unsettling in his gaze. After dinner, I cleared the dishes, leaving him with his newspaper. The house was enveloped in its usual quiet. Joshua had always been the perfect husband in every outward sense, responsible, caring, reliable. But somewhere in that reliability, I had lost myself. Every gesture of his, a habit, every word, predictable. And though I knew he did everything for our well-being, I found myself increasingly questioning if this well-being included me. In our bedroom, I laid out my underwear, choosing something comfortable over something beautiful. Joshua never noticed what I wore. It didn't matter to him. "As long as it's comfortable," he used to say, and I had grown used to adjusting. But comfort doesn't inspire. I wrapped myself in a blanket and picked up my phone. The social media feed flickered before my eyes until a notification caught my attention. An unknown number. The message was short and concise. "Let's meet at the office tomorrow, Madeline." Eric. Eric. I froze. My fingers instinctively locked the phone screen as questions flooded my mind. That name had suddenly broken through the monotony of my day. Our new director. We had barely had a chance to get to know each other, but something in his manner of speaking, in his voice, had left a mark. I turned off the light and lay in bed next to Joshua. His breathing was steady. He was already asleep. Listening to the slow rhythm of his breaths, I tried to make sense of what I was feeling. Anxiety? Intrigue? Or perhaps a mix of both. I knew I should have replied to Eric, but I didn't. There were too many possible meanings behind his message. Was it just a professional matter, or the beginning of something more? That night, I dreamed of the sound of glass shattering into a million shards. I stood among them, barefoot, unable to decide whether to step forward or back. In the dream, I knew that neither path would be safe. The Manhattan office made an impression from the very first step. Marble floors, massive windows flooding the space with light, and minimalist interiors that seemed to exude a quiet confidence in their own importance. I felt like a small part of something much greater, and, truthfully, a little out of place. The secretary greeted me and offered to wait in the conference room. I settled into a chair at the long wooden table, glancing around. The walls were lined with awards and photographs of buildings, architectural masterpieces brought to life under Eric West's leadership. Even the atmosphere seemed infused with his influence. When the door opened, he entered with an effortless confidence. Tall, with perfect posture, Eric looked at me as if he already knew everything about me, even though this was our first in-person meeting. "Madeline, a pleasure to meet you. My apologies for keeping you waiting." His voice was low, slightly raspy, yet soft. I extended my hand, but he simply inclined his head slightly, maintaining a distance that, for some reason, felt intriguing. We got straight to discussing the project. Eric listened intently, offering sparse but precise comments. His communication style was unusual. He didn't interrupt, but occasionally paused, as if to study my reaction. I could feel his gaze probing, making me question my confidence in what I was saying. Your approach is interesting, he said when I finished. You see the project not just as a task, but as an opportunity for creativity. That's rare. I smiled, trying to mask how much his words flattered me. But then he abruptly changed the subject. Have you ever thought that true success isn't about status, but about courage? I frowned. Courage? Success? The question caught me off guard. I think courage is often overrated, I replied cautiously. Sometimes stability is more important. Eric nodded, but a flicker of amusement danced in his eyes. Stability is good, but isn't it a little dull? His words struck a nerve. Success, courage, boredom. They swirled in my mind, touching not just on my career ambitions, but on my entire life. Had I really resigned myself to a role that would never be the lead? When we wrapped up, he offered to show me the building. We walked past employee offices and stopped at the massive windows overlooking Manhattan. Eric spoke about the importance of inspiration, of surrounding oneself with beauty. You deserve to be part of this, he said, gesturing to the cityscape. I didn't know how to respond. His words felt both genuine and strangely personal. When I was ready to leave, he walked me to my car. The parking lot was nearly empty, the air damp from a recent rain. I opened my car door, but hesitated, fumbling to remember where I had put my keys. Eric stood close enough to notice my unease. Here, he said, reaching out as if to help, and then suddenly leaned in closer. Our eyes met. I felt his breath, his scent, warm, faintly woody. It lasted a second, but felt like an eternity. He brushed his lips against mine, so lightly it was almost hesitant, like a test. I jerked back, as if snapping out of a trance, just as my phone rang. Joshua. Yes? My voice trembled. You're late, Maddie. Everything okay? Yes, I'll be home soon, I said too quickly, ending the call and sensing Eric's gaze still on me. He stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of apology. I'm sorry, that was out of line. I didn't reply, got into my car, and drove away. My heart pounded so hard it felt like I couldn't breathe. His words echoed in my mind. True success is courage. What was that? My weakness? Or the start of something I wouldn't be able to stop? Eric insisted that dinner take place in a small restaurant in the city center, far from the bright lights of Manhattan. The place was modest, wooden tables, soft lighting, and the aroma of fresh bread wafting through the air. I arrived a little early, nervously fiddling with a napkin. It's work, I reminded myself. He invited me to discuss the project. It's just work. But the moment Eric walked in, the atmosphere shifted. His confident stride, easy smile, and unassuming gaze, like he could instantly sense what I was feeling, changed everything. Thank you for coming, he said as he sat across from me, removing his coat and motioning for the waiter. I thought a setting like this would be more suitable for discussing creativity. I nodded, though something inside me tightened. Creativity or something else? We placed our orders, and the conversation began with work. Eric talked about the details of the new project, how he envisioned its development. I listened, occasionally offering my thoughts. But with each question he posed, I noticed how the discussion veered further and further from specific tasks. So, how did you decide to pursue this career? He asked, leaning his elbows on the table. I shrugged. I've always enjoyed creating something new, finding an idea and bringing it to life. It's what gives me a sense of purpose. Eric nodded thoughtfully. Purpose. That's a good word. But how do you measure it? Through your projects? Or something more personal? His gaze burned right through me. I lowered my eyes, feeling the words catch in my throat. I don't know, I finally admitted. I suppose I'm still trying to figure that out. The food arrived, but I hardly noticed it. His questions stirred thoughts I had long tried to suppress. Over the years of marriage to Joshua, I had grown used to being part of something bigger: a family, work, routine. But where was I in all of it? I took a deep breath. Sometimes it feels like I'm just part of the furniture in someone else's life. Eric paused for a moment, then smiled. Not mockingly, but as if he had heard something familiar in me. You don't strike me as someone who's content to stay in the background. You're brighter than you think. His words hit harder than I expected. Why did he see something Joshua never noticed? Or perhaps he just wanted me to believe he did. Meanwhile, back home, Joshua stood in the middle of our bedroom, looking at an old box. Inside were photos from the early years of our marriage, pictures from picnics, parties, trips, both of us smiling, as if the world belonged to us alone. He held one photo in his hand, me laughing, my hand on his shoulder. It was taken on the day we first went boating. He remembered thinking everything was perfect back then. But why did those moments now feel so distant? He realized he couldn't even remember the last time he'd seen me laugh like that near him. At the restaurant, I looked at Eric and wondered why his words so easily broke through the walls I'd spent years building around myself. And you? I asked, wanting to ease the tension. What's important to you, status, or the courage you mentioned? Eric leaned back in his chair, considering. For me? Probably freedom. The ability to choose and shape my life the way I want. His words struck a chord. Freedom. That word sounded as if it had never held any meaning in my life. We fell silent, and the quiet spoke louder than the conversation ever could. Eric leaned slightly forward, his gaze lingering on my face. I felt warmth spread through me and quickly looked away. When we stepped outside, the air was fresh, tinged with the faint scent of rain. Eric walked me to a taxi at an unhurried pace. Thank you for the company, he said as I climbed into the car. I enjoy talking to you. You're an extraordinary person, Madeline. Those words stayed with me even after I returned home. Joshua was already asleep, his breathing steady. I went to the bathroom and looked at my reflection. Eric's words echoed in my mind. You're brighter than you think. So why did I feel so dim? Eric's office felt different this time. Or maybe I was seeing it differently. The space seemed too expansive, too quiet. The large windows flooded the room with light, emphasizing every detail. The clean lines of the furniture, the muted tones, the faint aroma of coffee. Eric invited me into his office, the same one I had visited before. But now, the tension I felt in his presence had become almost tangible. I tried to appear composed, a carefully chosen business suit, minimal makeup, nothing that might betray my inner uncertainty. We began discussing the project. His ideas were bold, even thrilling. He painted grand visions, proposed daring solutions. I tried to stay professional, absorbing every detail, but I kept catching my thoughts drifting elsewhere. Eric seemed to notice. At one point, he leaned back in his chair and studied me intently. You're tense, he said. Is something wrong? I shook my head. Everything's fine, just a lot of work. Madeline, I know you're not someone who does things without reason, but tell me honestly, what are you looking for? His question caught me off guard. Too direct, too personal. I froze for a moment, feeling my defenses begin to crack. I'm looking for meaning, I said sharply before I could think better of it. And I'm not sure you can give it to me. Eric wasn't offended. If anything, his eyes lit up with curiosity. He leaned forward slightly, as if to close the space between us. What if I told you that meaning isn't where you're looking for it? The words hit home. I tried to ignore them, to steer the conversation back to the project, but something inside me refused to let go. I glanced at his hands resting on the table, steady, confident. Then I noticed his gaze, fixed on me as though he were trying to solve a puzzle. We continued discussing the project, but the tension in the room had shifted. His words lingered in my mind, and I felt my usual armor begin to crack. When I reached for my notebook to jot down some notes, our hands accidentally brushed. It was just a moment, but it carried an energy so charged that I froze. Eric didn't pull his hand away immediately either. I felt the warmth of his skin, a subtle current spreading through me. I knew I couldn't let it show, but it was impossible to deny what I felt. Before anything else could happen, the door to the office creaked open, and the voice of his assistant interrupted the moment. "Mr. West, your next conference call is in 5 minutes." Eric withdrew his hand and looked up at the assistant, his expression once again impeccably professional. "Thank you, Stephanie. I'll wrap up in a couple of minutes." Stephanie nodded and closed the door, leaving us alone again. "Madeline," he said before I could rise, "sometimes what we're looking for is closer than we think." I didn't respond. I simply stood, gathered my things, and left the office. When I got back to my car, my heart was still racing. The conversation had been too personal, too close to something I was afraid to confront. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring into the distance, asking myself, why did I let him get so close? And what does he really want from me? Evening had fallen over our home, yet I could still feel the tension of the day clinging to me like a sticky web. Returning late, I quietly closed the door behind me, careful not to wake Joshua, though I knew he wasn't asleep. His habit of reading in bed sometimes annoyed me, but tonight it felt like something safe, predictable. When I stepped into the bedroom, he was lying there with a book in his hands, but his gaze immediately shifted to me. I noticed how his eyes examined every detail. My hair hastily pulled into a messy ponytail, my slightly wrinkled blazer, even the way I avoided meeting his gaze. "You're late," he said softly, but there was something in his voice I hadn't heard before, a hint of hidden concern. "Work ran over," I replied, placing my bag by the bed and starting to take off my shoes. My tone was light, but I knew my words sounded clipped, as if I was trying to end the conversation as quickly as possible. "Is everything okay?" His question caught me off guard. I looked up at him and felt a pang inside. He was watching me as though trying to figure out something important. For a second, I wanted to tell the truth. Not everything, of course, but at least enough to ease the weight on my chest. Instead, I simply nodded. "Of course. Just tired." Joshua didn't press further, but his silence was telling. I knew him too well not to notice the way he tensed. His hands gripped the book a little too tightly. He wasn't the type to openly express his emotions, but his unease was palpable. Turning away, I headed to the bathroom, where I spent more time than usual staring at my reflection. When I returned, he was lying down, facing the wall. I slipped into bed beside him, trying to steady my breathing, but my mind was a storm of thoughts. Eric, his words, his look, and Joshua, his silence, heavier than any words could be. The next morning, I got up early and left for work in a hurry, avoiding any direct conversation with my husband. Throughout the day, I struggled to focus, the feeling of losing control over the situation growing stronger with every passing hour. Meanwhile, Joshua decided to clean the house. It was something he did to clear his mind. During his tidying, he stumbled upon my phone, left on the kitchen table by accident. The screen lit up with a new message from Eric. "Eric, thanks for the conversation yesterday. You're helping me see things differently." Joshua wasn't one to pry into someone else's messages, but this text hit harder than he expected. Conversation? About what? One thought after another began to form in his mind. He stared at the screen for a long time before setting the phone back down, determined not to jump to conclusions. That evening, as I stayed late at work again, he called me. His voice sounded calm, but I knew it was only a facade. "Hey, do you remember where the car keys are?" I hesitated. The question caught me off guard, and I couldn't answer immediately. The pause lasted only a second, but it felt like an eternity. Um, they should be in the drawer in the hallway, I finally said, but my voice was strained. Too strained. Are you sure everything's okay, Maddie? His next question felt like a cold shower. Yes, of course. Just a bit tired. I tried again to deflect, avoiding a direct answer. When I came home late that night, he didn't say anything about his suspicions, but his gaze spoke louder than words. Joshua was beginning to piece things together. And that realization brought not just jealousy, but fear. The fear that the life he thought was secure might be on the verge of falling apart. The rooftop restaurant was flawless. A soft twilight enveloped the space, with golden light from candles reflecting off the glass walls. The view of Manhattan seemed almost unreal, skyscrapers shining like stars, while the faint hum of the city lingered in the background, as if the chaos of the world had been muted just for us to hear each other. Eric was already seated at a corner table. He looked relaxed, but his posture betrayed a quiet intensity. His gaze found me immediately, and I felt a tightening in my chest. This place was different. His intentions were different. But I had still come. You're here, he said with a faint smile, rising to help me with my coat. You said this was about work, I replied, my voice steadier than I'd expected. It is about work. He stepped back, studying me carefully. But we both know it's not only that. We ordered wine and a few appetizers, though the food didn't matter. The conversation began with the project. Eric spoke of concepts, vision, breaking stereotypes. I tried to keep the discussion professional, but his presence seemed to pull more and more out of me. You're too rigid, Madeline, he said at one point. You work as though everything depends on rules. But what will you do if there are no rules? His question stung. I took a sip of wine, trying to buy time to respond. I rely on structure. It gives me control, I said finally. Eric smirked. Control is an illusion. You're afraid of losing what you have. But sometimes, fear is just a step toward freedom. I fell silent, his words striking a chord deep within me. Was it fear, or the habit of living the way others expected me to? I stared into my wineglass, then back at Eric. He seemed utterly confident in what he was saying, as though he already knew my answer before I did. Sometimes I feel stuck, I admitted, almost involuntarily. Eric leaned in slightly, his gaze holding mine. But you know you can get out of it. You feel it, don't you? His words sounded like a challenge, and in that moment, I stopped thinking. I leaned forward and kissed him. It was my choice, not an impulse, but a deliberate decision. I felt his hands gently rest on my shoulders. The moment was filled with everything, my doubts, his certainty, my guilt, and something else I couldn't name. But then I pulled away, not out of regret, out of the realization that I had crossed a line, one that would change everything. Eric said nothing, simply watching me. In his eyes, I saw that he understood more than I had spoken aloud. Meanwhile, I had no idea that Joshua was still awake at home. He sat in the kitchen, fully dressed, unable to bring himself to go to bed. His eyes were fixed on his phone, where a tracking app displayed my location, an upscale hotel. At first, he thought it must be a mistake, but the longer he stared at the screen, the clearer it became. Questions flooded his mind, questions he didn't want answers to. Why? With whom? What was she doing there? Joshua stared at the blinking dot on the map, feeling everything he thought was secure begin to crumble. He knew he shouldn't have checked, but now he was glad he did. I came home late. The night outside was quiet, but inside, everything screamed that something had changed. Joshua was sitting in the living room, his face expressionless, though his eyes were full of unspoken questions. You're late, he said simply. Work, I replied, avoiding his gaze. He said nothing, just kept looking at me. His silence was worse than any argument. I walked past him, feeling his gaze burn into my back. I closed the bedroom door behind me, collapsed onto the bed, and felt fear creeping over me. But it wasn't fear of Joshua. It was the fear of knowing there was no way back. I parked the car by the house and sat still for a while, staring at the living room windows. The lights were on, and I knew Joshua was waiting. Usually, this filled me with a sense of comfort and peace, but not tonight. My chest tightened with an unpleasant sensation, a mix of fear and guilt, as if something was about to happen, something I couldn't avoid. I placed my hands on the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. Just go inside. Nothing will happen, I repeated to myself like a mantra, but I knew I was lying to myself. Tonight, something was going to change. When I walked in, the smell of coffee mingled with something familiar, a feeling of anxious anticipation. Joshua was sitting in the armchair, a cup by his side. He wore his usual cozy sweater, but his posture gave away his tension. His legs were slightly apart, his back straight, his gaze fixed on me. There was no familiar smile. He looked like someone who had been waiting a long time to ask a single life-altering question. "You're late," he said, his voice calm, which only made it worse for me. I tossed my bag onto the chair and headed for the kitchen. Yeah, the project ran late. Eric wanted to discuss something important. At the mention of Eric's name, Joshua raised an eyebrow slightly. His gaze burned into my back, though he didn't raise his voice or say a word. I poured myself a glass of water, trying to buy time, but it was pointless. He knew I was avoiding his eyes, and that only deepened his suspicions. When I returned to the living room, he stood up from the chair. I felt his presence fill the room. Joshua stepped closer, but not too close, enough not to overwhelm me, and then he spoke. "Do you love him?" The question I feared most came out softly, but struck like a thunderclap. My breath caught, and I couldn't find the words. His eyes searched mine, but I avoided his gaze. "Joshua," I began, but my voice broke. He didn't let me finish. "I want the truth, Maddie. Just answer me. Do you love him?" I tried again to respond, but instead, I simply shook my head. It was such an obvious evasion that I might as well have stayed silent. It would have meant the same thing. He lowered his head, ran a hand over his face, and exhaled quietly. "You're not even trying to deny it," he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only bitterness. My heart pounded. I wanted to tell him it wasn't what he thought, that it was a mistake, that nothing serious had happened, but my words would have sounded like lies, even if I believed them myself. "It's not what you think," I finally said, trying to regain control of the situation. He gave a bitter smile. "Then tell me what it is. I want to hear your explanation." Those words cut through me. I knew I couldn't give him an answer that would make things right. Anything I said would only make it worse. He stepped back, his face serious but calm. That calmness scared me the most. "I thought we had something real. Whatever happened over the years, I believed we could still fix it. But now I'm not sure you want the same thing." His words felt like a knife. A wave of shame washed over me, but at the same time, something inside me rebelled. "Joshua, it's not that simple. You don't see how much I'm trying." He cut me off sharply. "Trying what? To make sure I don't notice you spending nights at hotels? To make me think everything is fine while you don't even know what you want?" I couldn't take it anymore. "You never asked me what I needed, Joshua. Never. You're so sure you're right that you don't even notice how lost I feel in this house, in this life." The words spilled out of me before I could think them through. We stood facing each other, both wounded, but neither of us made a move to resolve the conflict. He took another deep breath and said, "I loved you, Madeline. Maybe more than you deserve." With that, he turned and walked into the bedroom, leaving me alone in the living room. I sank onto the couch, burying my head in my hands. I felt like screaming inside, but no sound came out. Everything was broken. And yet, I couldn't say it had happened suddenly. It was like a slow-motion fall I just hadn't wanted to see. That night, I sat on the couch, staring into emptiness. Our home, once filled with warmth and love, now felt foreign, and Joshua's words lingered with me like a shadow that would never fade. The terrace of Eric's office overlooked the city, which had always seemed to me like a living entity, noisy, vibrant, chaotic. But today, Manhattan felt dead, too silent. I stood leaning against the cold metal railing, feeling the wind pierce through my coat. Every part of me was trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of what I was about to say. Eric came out a few minutes after I arrived. He was in his impeccable gray suit, as if heading to an important meeting, but his face betrayed exhaustion. Not physical, but emotional. He approached me, maintaining a deliberate distance. "You wanted to talk?" he asked calmly, though I could sense a trace of wariness in his voice. I nodded slowly, but didn't speak right away. The words seemed lodged in my throat. Everything that had happened between us couldn't simply be erased, but I couldn't go on like this any longer. "I can't do this anymore," I finally said, avoiding his gaze. "I thought I would find something here, a meaning I'd lost a long time ago, but I've only created more questions. Maybe it's me, or maybe it's us." Eric frowned but didn't interrupt. He gave me the space to say what I needed to. "You mean so much to me, Eric, but I feel like I've cornered myself. And if I don't stop now, I'll destroy everything that's left of my life. I just can't." His silence was deafening. He stood there, looking at me as if trying to understand where it had all gone wrong. Finally, he took a deep breath, slipped his hands into his pockets, and said, "I thought we were the same. Two people stuck in their worlds who found in each other what they'd been missing." His words stung. They were true. And yet, I knew I couldn't keep walking this path. "Eric," I said, meeting his gaze, summoning every ounce of strength I had. "I don't know who I am anymore. I only know that I want to find out. But I can't do that with you." He stood there for a few moments, seemingly processing my words, then gave a slight nod. "All right," he said softly but firmly. "I respect your decision." As I left the terrace, the wind lashed against my cheeks like icy needles. I knew I had made the right choice, but that didn't make it any less painful. Meanwhile, Joshua was at home. I knew he had already made up his mind, even if he hadn't said it out loud. When I returned last night, he had looked like a man who had already said his goodbyes in his heart. At that moment, he was sitting on the floor of our bedroom, a suitcase by his side. He was carefully packing my things into a box. Everything that reminded him of me was leaving our home with that box. As he lifted one of the drawers, a card fell out. It was signed but never sent. Joshua picked it up and began to read. "I always wanted to be your home, but you never noticed as I became invisible." His hands trembled. The card slowly slipped to the floor. He stared at it as if it held the key to a mystery he had never been able to solve. He sat down on the bed, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. He sat there, cradling his head in his hands, unable to continue packing or stop altogether. The room was silent, but it was filled with memories, regrets, and unbearable pain. At that moment, I stopped outside the door. I held the key in my hand, but couldn't bring myself to turn the lock. I knew I could never walk into that space the way I had before. Our house was no longer a home. Everything between us had dissolved into emptiness. I turned away and walked in the other direction, leaving behind everything that once felt so familiar. This was the end, and I felt it in every fiber of my being.